All right, let's dive into this new Nosferatu film. I'm guessing if you're listening to this, you're probably already familiar with the original. But we've got some articles here comparing the remake to the 1922 classic and some background on the silent film era, too. And let me tell you, there are some things that even the biggest Nosferatu fans out there might not know about.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The way Eggers is going about this. He seems to be like really trying to find that balance between honoring the original and also, bringing something new to the table.
Yeah, it's not just a straight-up
Yeah.
remake, is it?
Mhm.
It's more like he's digging even deeper into the story.
Yeah.
And one of the things that jumped out at me right away was how different Orlok looks this time around. You know, in the 1922 film, he had that, well, kind of rodent-like thing going on.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, these articles are describing Bill Skarsgård as like a full-on grotesque rotting corpse. It's enough to make you wonder if what he really needs is a good moisturizer, not a stake through the heart.
Haha. Yeah, I see what you mean. But you've hit on something interesting there, about Eggers' approach. He's really going for a much more visceral, like almost disturbingly real take on the vampire. I mean, he even said in an interview that he wanted Orlok to look like, and I quote, a dead Transylvanian nobleman. So he's really looking back at like historical burial practices and stuff for inspiration.
Huh. So it's like instead of that kind of stylized, almost theatrical vampire we saw in the original, it's more like a really literal interpretation of what a centuries-old corpse would actually look like, huh?
Exactly, yeah. It's definitely a bold choice, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah. And it's definitely going to make this film a lot more intense, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And this whole idea of like grounding things in a more historical way, it goes beyond just Orlok's appearance too. The remake also introduces some new characters, and it really expands the backstories of some of the characters we already know.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Like, for example, you've got Willem Dafoe playing Professor Von Franz, and he's a vampire hunter, so that adds a whole new level of conflict to the story.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's definitely going to shake things up.
Yeah.
And it's not just adding new people either. It sounds like they've given some of the original characters a lot more to do as well.
Right, yeah.
Like Knock. He's not just like Orlok's creepy little sidekick anymore. I mean, he's a full-blown occultist now with his own agenda. He's actively working to summon Orlok, which is kind of wild. Do you think all these changes, like, do you think it risks making the story too crowded? Or do you think it actually adds more depth to the world of the film?
That's a really good question, actually. And it's probably something critics and audiences are going to debate for a while. But, from what I've seen and heard so far, it seems like Eggers is being really careful about how he's weaving these new elements in. Even characters like Friedrich and Anna, who were kind of just background figures in the original, they're given more depth this time around. Their deaths become more tragic because we actually understand their lives and their relationships better.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like he's building a bigger, more intricate tapestry, right? Like
Yeah.
adding all these threads of backstory and motivation to make the whole thing richer and more complex.
Exactly.
And speaking of complex characters, we have to talk about Ellen, because her role in this new film is maybe the most interesting change of all. I mean, in the 1922 film, she's very much a damsel in distress. But in this version, she's a lot more than that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. She's got a lot more agency in this one. And it starts right from the beginning. We find out that when she was a child, she actually summoned Orlok. So there's this connection between them that goes way back, long before the events of the main story even start.
Wow. So it's like almost a dark fairy tale element. A young girl unknowingly summons this monstrous force. You have to wonder what kind of effect that would have on her, even before Orlok shows up again later in her life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it completely changes their whole dynamic, too. It's not just a simple predator-prey situation anymore. There are these hints of, like, this twisted, almost obsessive connection between them that goes way beyond just, her being a victim.
Yeah, it makes things a lot more interesting, that's for sure. Kind of makes you wonder if maybe Orlok was into that whole bad boy vibe even back then.
Maybe.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it adds a lot of intrigue to their relationship.
Oh, definitely. And it gives Ellen a much more active role in her own fate.
Right.
Which is a really interesting change from the original. I'm really curious to see how that plays out on screen.
Oh.
But, okay, we can't talk about Nosferatu without talking about, well, how he gets his dinner.
And
And it sounds like Eggers is doing things a little differently there, too.
yeah, he is. So in the remake, Orlok doesn't go for the classic neck bite. He's got a much more brutal approach. He attacks his victims' chests.
Whoa. Okay. Well, at least with a neck bite, you could try to hide it with a scarf or a turtleneck or something. But this is a whole other level of gruesome. Do you think, is he just trying to shock people, or is there a deeper reason for this change?
I think it's Probably a bit of both, honestly. Eggers has always been a filmmaker who likes to push boundaries
Hmm.
and explore those darker parts of human nature. But there's also a thematic reason for this change, too. He's mentioned that he was inspired by these old folk tales, where vampires would target the chest specifically, like the heart, as a way to drain their victim's life force.
So it's tapping into this, like, primal fear associated with vampires?
Exactly. It's about stripping away that romanticized image we often have of vampires
Hmm.
and presenting them as these truly monstrous, predatory creatures.
Okay, so I'm starting to rethink my whole vampires are just misunderstood romantics idea.
Uh-huh. Well, I wouldn't say all vampires are misunderstood romantics, but in this case, Eggers is definitely making Orlok as terrifying as possible.
Yeah. So I've got a new look, new characters, and new levels of gore. I'm starting to think this isn't just a remake at all. It's more like a complete reimagining of the whole Nosferatu myth.
Mm.
But I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface here. What other secrets does this film have in store for us?
One thing that really got me thinking was how much they're going into the whole occult side of things. The original Nosferatu definitely touched on it, but seems like the remake's going to really weave it into the story.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I remember those articles mentioned, like Enochian script and the summoning of Belial. It sounds like we're moving past just, basic vampire stuff and into some really intense supernatural territory.
Yeah, exactly. And what makes it even more interesting is how all that ties in with the real life stuff going on when they made the first film. Remember all that stuff about the filmmakers' experiences in World War One?
Oh, yeah, like how those real life events and the trauma and the whole atmosphere of that time, it really seems like it all kind of seeped into that original Nosferatu film.
Right. I mean, both Murnau, the director, and Grau, the producer, they both went through some pretty heavy stuff during the war. Grau even said that he got the idea for a vampire film from a Serbian farmer who thought his own father was undead.
Ooh,
Like, it's straight out of folklore, isn't it? But it just shows you how these personal experiences can have such a powerful effect on the art people create.
definitely. It makes you wonder how much of that darkness, how much of it actually ended up in the original film. Like some
Hmm.
people think that the whole plague imagery in Nosferatu, it could be a reflection of all the anxiety around disease and all the social upheaval in Germany after the war.
Yeah, I could see that. It's a pretty compelling theory. I mean, think about it. Orlok becomes more than just this monster, right? He represents these unseen forces that are threatening to destroy society. Just like the war and all the unrest that followed it did, it adds this whole other layer of meaning to the story.
Wow, yeah. I love all these layers we're uncovering. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, but instead of tears, we're getting chills. But tell me, how does the 2024 film handle all this? Is it like a direct adaptation of the original's approach, or is it doing something new?
Well, it seems like Eggers is taking those themes and kind of amplifying them, using more modern storytelling techniques and a more contemporary perspective.
Hmm.
He's not just trying to recreate the 1922 film exactly, he's reinterpreting it through a modern lens. Like, for instance, the plague in the remake is a lot more upfront. It really shows the devastating effect it has on the people of Wisborg.
So it's less about this, like, looming threat,
Yeah.
and more about the actual visceral reality of suffering and loss.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the visuals, too. Eggers is exploring the psychological impact of the plague, how it affects the characters' mental states and their relationships with each other. It's a much more internal exploration of fear and despair, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like he's trying to capture the full weight of what the plague means, not just the physical horror of it, but also the emotional and psychological toll it takes on
Yeah.
people. It makes me think, could this focus on the emotional side of the plague be a reflection of, like,
Yeah.
our own experiences with pandemics and all the collective trauma we faced recently?
That's a really interesting point, actually. It's definitely possible that Eggers is, maybe consciously or unconsciously,
Yeah.
drawing on those shared experiences to create a more, a more relatable picture of fear and uncertainty in the face of something like that.
It's like, even though we're dealing with these fantastical stories,
Mm-hmm.
they can still touch on some very real human experiences and fears.
Sure.
But I have a feeling Eggers has even more surprises up his sleeve.
Oh.
Those articles also mentioned a pretty weird detail about, how Orlok casts spells.
Ah, yeah, that's a fascinating one, isn't it?
Apparently, when he's doing his whole spell casting thing, he doesn't just say some made-up words.
Nope.
Eggers actually had him speak in reconstructed Dacian.
Yeah.
Dacian, like the ancient language they spoke in Romania before the Roman Empire.
The one and only.
I'm guessing that's not a language they teach in your average acting class.
Haha, Probably not. It's one of those details that most people probably won't even notice. But for those who do, it adds this whole other level of authenticity and historical depth. It really shows how committed Eggers is to grounding even the fantastical elements in some kind of reality.
It's like a little Easter egg for history and language nerds, huh?
Exactly.
But it also just shows how much thought and detail he puts into every aspect of this world he's creating. Which brings us to a bigger question, I think. With all these changes and additions, is the 2024 Nosferatu actually just a remake? Or is it something more than that? Is it a reimagining, a new story told through an old lens, or maybe a modern exploration of these timeless themes?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think it's one that each viewer is going to have to answer for themselves.
Yeah, it really does feel like Eggers is doing something pretty special here. It's not just a remake, is it? It's like he's using these classic elements to say something new, something that speaks to, our fears and anxieties today. What do you think? Like, what's at the heart of all this?
I think he's using Nosferatu to explore those darker parts of human nature, like how fear and desire can get all mixed up together. The changes to Ellen's character are a good example of that. It's not so clear-cut anymore who's the victim and who's, well, I don't know, participating, I guess. It definitely raises some interesting questions about, free will and the nature of evil, all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It's making me think about the whole vampire myth in a different way. It's not just monster versus victim anymore.
Right.
And the way he's bringing in the historical context, too, the trauma of the war, the anxieties around disease, it adds so much depth to the story. It's like he's saying that the real monsters might not be the supernatural ones. Maybe it's the darkness that's already inside us.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful interpretation. And it definitely fits with a lot of Eggers' other work, too. He's not afraid to look at those uncomfortable truths about humanity.
No, he's not.
And he does it in such a visually striking way.
Yeah, he really does. I'm almost tempted to go back and watch the original Nosferatu again now, with fresh eyes, to see if I can spot those same themes lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah, for sure.
It just goes to show that these classic stories, they stick around for a reason. They tap into something timeless about what it means to be human.
Exactly. And I think that's why this new Nosferatu is more than just a remake. It's like bringing that classic tale back to life, reminding us of how powerful these stories can be, how they reflect our own fears, no matter what time period we're in.
So for anyone listening who's, already a fan of the original, what's the one thing you'd want them to keep in mind before watching this new version?
I'd say go in with an open mind. Don't expect it to be exactly like the 1922 film. Eggers is inviting us into a world that's both familiar and new at the same time. Pay attention to the details, the historical stuff, the deeper themes he's playing with, and be prepared to be challenged.
I love that, yeah. This isn't just a nostalgia trip. It's a journey into the darkness, both on screen and within ourselves, maybe.
Yeah.
So to everyone listening, watch the film, think about it, and then ask yourself, what does Nosferatu mean to you today in the 21st century?
And who knows, maybe it'll make you look a little closer at the shadows in your own life and wonder what might be hiding there.
Until next time, happy viewing.